Well, now we come to John chapter 4 and the story of the Samaritan woman. And to understand and appreciate this story, you have to know who Samaritans were. And the short version is that Samaritans were people from a certain area in Israel, from Samaria, who were considered second class because of their partial Jewish descent. They traced their lineage back to Jews who had intermarried with other nations and other religions. And so Jews looked down on them because their religion had been affected by that heritage. They didn't worship God in Jerusalem at the temple, the way that true Jews did. Instead, they worshipped on a mountain called Mount Gerizim. And these two groups didn't get along, even though Samaria was right in the middle of the country. It was between Galilee in the north, where Jesus was from, and Judea in the south, where Jerusalem was and most of the population lived. So verse 4 says that Jesus had to go through Samaria. What's interesting about that verse is that it's actually not true. No one ever had to go through Samaria, and in fact, most people didn't. Most people intentionally avoided Samaria if they were making the journey from Judea to Galilee, which verse 3 says is what Jesus is doing. They would go around. They would cross the Jordan River out of the country, make their way north, and then cross the river again back into Galilee, specifically to avoid going into Samaria and being tainted by the Samaritans. But it says that Jesus had to pass through, which means that he insisted on passing through. It means he said to his disciples, no, we're going this way. Jewish religion at this time was highly exclusive. Everywhere you looked, there were reminders that you were not one of the privileged few that God really smiled on. It was better to be a Jew than a Gentile, but it was better to be a Jewish man than a Jewish woman, and it was better to be a Pharisee than a commoner. So unless you were one of those elite, you just knew all the time that you don't quite measure up. And if that's been your experience of religion, as kind of an insider's club, I just want to apologize. And I just want to let you know that is not the heart of God. As you see in this passage, in this story, Jesus has a heart for the outsider. So it says that he insisted on traveling through. He meets this woman at the well at noon, which is highly unusual. Most women went to the well in the cool of the morning or the evening, which means that she's probably a social outcast from her own community. We'll see why a little later in the story. And then even though she's a Samaritan and even though she's a woman, Jesus gives her the dignity of blessing him. He asks her for a drink. He doesn't act like he's better than her. And then he makes this offer. He tells her that if she asked him, he would give her living water. Her response to that is a lot like Nicodemus in chapter 3. She doesn't get it. She kind of seems to be ignorant of spiritual things. Jesus explains that this is an offer for eternal life. He uses that phrase again, eternal life. He also talks about it in terms of spiritual satisfaction. When you drink his living water, you'll never thirst again. And he implies that everyone is kind of spiritually thirsty. Well, she still doesn't understand. She thinks he's talking about physical water. She says, great, I would love a lifetime supply and not have to come to the well. Jesus says, okay, go get your husband. She says, I don't have a husband. And Jesus says, I know. You've had 5. And the man you're with now is not your husband. Meaning either they've never gotten married or perhaps even that he is someone else's husband. And she at that point simply changes the subject. She wants to get the focus off of herself. She's impressed that Jesus knows so much about her life, but she calls him a prophet and then very quickly asks a theological question, which is a good question. It's something that she really wanted to know, I think, but it's a safe topic. It's a way of getting the spotlight off of her own life. It's not about her. Her question is, what's the right place to worship? Because my people worship here on this mountain. You Jews worship in Jerusalem. What do you, since you're such a prophet, what do you say is the right answer? Jesus is so gracious and so kind that he lets her change the subject and he answers her question. And we'll talk about that answer in the next video. But I just want to close with this question for you. If Jesus is saying that everyone is spiritually thirsty, then what has that looked like in your life? What are the ways that you have tried to satisfy the thirst of your soul that have not worked? Now, I know that's a very personal question, but as we can see, that's the kind of question that Jesus asks. For this woman, her spiritual thirst had left behind her a trail of broken relationships, and she hadn't been satisfied by any of that. We'll talk more about their conversation in the next video. And thanks for watching.